Hey everyone, Fire here, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to farm an early Mageblood from Expedition. As with my previous video, we're going to start off with the same disclaimer. You need to pretty much know life the game and already be good at the game in order to get your Mageblood by day 3 or 5. However, because this is one of those strategies that I've handpicked that can't be ruined by a lot of other people doing it, this is still going to be a very good strategy for you no matter what kind of player you are. As long as you follow this guide and put in some amount of preparation, you're going to have a pretty good time and farm quite a lot of money. The premise of this strategy is basically to start farming Expedition Scarabs as early as possible. So as soon as you get to tier 14 plus maps, you're going to start slamming Expedition Scarabs of all kinds into your maps. You will start at Rusted, and you're eventually going to move up to Gilded before you're eventually going to consider Logbook farming. Once you get into Logbook farming, you're going to start at Rog with a focus on generating influenced jewelry and armor, as well as Rog Crafting, and then finally you're going to move on to Tujen Logbooks, and maybe in the long term even Danig Logbooks. Now, the Expedition theme of this mechanic is not arbitrary. Expedition Scarabs are by far the strongest Scarabs to be putting into your map device if you are using the artifacts and turning them in at Danig and Tujen, and on top of that, Logbooks are some of the best overall strategies in the entire game at the moment, and they have been for the past 2 patches since the base rewards were nerfed and the artifacts were made non-tradable. So it's actually just a complete coincidence that this strategy entirely revolves around Expedition, all the way from maps to logbooks. If some other Scarab was better than Expedition, then we would be doing that to fund our eventual entry into logbooks, but this does have the fortunate upside of being able to reuse some of our artifacts from the Scarabs when we get into logbook farming. What are the pros and cons? Well, to start with, this has some of the lowest gear requirements compared to any of the other Mageblood farming strategies. In fact, this is the second easiest of the top 6 or 7 strategies out, in my opinion. It also has a very low amount of trading time and setup. You only need to buy the Scarabs or the logbooks. Tujen farming means that you're only ever going to have to liquidate raw currency plus a few other items such as coins, astragali, and scrap metal, which means your overall trading time is very low. And this is a fairly relaxing and fun form of self-contained content. A lot of it feeds back into itself, so when you eventually get to doing Danig logbooks, you can earn back Danig and Tujen logbooks from that cycle. You can earn exotic coins and discounted Tujen artifacts, and so it self-sustains itself partially. There is very minimal time spent not doing Expedition if you want to be doing Expedition. Expedition does have a few major cons, however. It's impossible to level up once you start farming logbooks. If you start farming logbooks and you're level 85, you're probably not going to get much further than, say, level 86 or 7, and that's only if you're playing carefully. If you're doing this efficiently, say goodbye to ever getting to level 90, unless you're very lucky. Now, another major downside of Expedition is that it has a very high learning curve, and it's one of the most complex mechanics to initially learn. Although once you've learned it, it's simple and you can do it mindlessly. Learning it for the first time is hard, will take a long time, and it will require quite a bit of practice. And that's also a problem if you don't, because it is very easy to fail, and not just not make a lot of money from it, but you can outright lose money while doing it if you're spending the artifacts incorrectly and buying expensive logbooks that you aren't rolling correctly and that you aren't running correctly. So if you're not willing to put the time in here, just completely avoid Expedition. Finally, it's also very hard to evaluate the profitability of the items. You're basically farming artifacts that aren't tradable. You earn them in different ratios, you earn them randomly, and then you spend them in different ratios. You can even earn them in completely different ratios, whether you're getting them as discounted artifacts from Danig or from the map expeditions or even from the logbooks. So there's a lot of complexity here. It's very hard to evaluate whether you're even making money until you tabulate everything out into a spreadsheet. This is kind of a big drawback for people who are risk averse and don't want to take risks with their currency. Recommended builds are pretty much just any good league starter. Detonate Dead is going to do really well here, Explosive Arrow Ballistas will do really well, Skeleton Mages of course will do well, any Tornado Shot build is going to be absolutely fine, and Seismic Traps will also do really well. Methodology here is actually pretty basic. You're going to take most of the Expedition stuff on the tree. The only thing you don't want to take is the notable that gives you an extra chance to encounter an expedition in the map, because I believe you are only limited to one anyway, so getting the extra 4% chance when you're popping Scarabs doesn't matter. Then obviously you're going to be putting Expedition Scarabs into every map, and once you move on from Expeditions in maps, you're going to be running Rog logbooks, eventually moving on to Tujen logbooks, and finally moving on to Danig logbooks if you can get a build capable of doing Olroth. The steps for this are pretty simple. You're going to rush tier 14 maps and get your hands on any kind of Expedition Scarabs that you can bulk buy. Gilded is better than Polished, and Polished is better than Rusted, but if Gilded and Polished can only be purchased in singles and the bulk prices are absolutely ridiculous, like 30C each, then obviously you just want to stick to rusted for the time being. You're going to self-farm a bunch of your logbooks, and you can sell the ones you don't want, but if you do need currency for upgrades early, you may as well just sell the Tujen and Danig logbooks as you get them, because you can always buy them later, and when you are logbook farming, you're going to have to buy them. You're not going to be able to self-farm all of the logbooks that you're going to end up running. So you're going to be earning artifacts while you're farming the map expeditions. You should buy exotic coins and burial medallions in order to cycle through and spend these artifacts. This is a large part of the profit that you're earning from the scarabs, so you have to do it. Now, you don't have to spend the Rog artifacts, but I would recommend it because scrap metal is very cheap and you're going to be capped out on Rog artifacts otherwise. Eventually, you're going to buy a bunch of Rog logbooks if you really want to. You can just skip this and go straight to Tujen, but be aware that a lot of Tujen's profitability comes from being able to kill a tier 14 plus Varana. If your build's not ready for that, maybe just skip it. It's up to you. I'm not going to tell you that there's a right or wrong answer here because I haven't done enough testing to say for sure. So when you're doing the Rog logbooks, you want to focus on jewelry and influence remnants because selling influenced jewelry is very lucrative. These remnants basically combine. The jewelry items can also roll with the influence from the influenced remnants. You can also do this with armor items, so you can drop influenced armor, but the influenced jewelry is where a lot of the money is going to come from, and you're going to be earning Rog artifacts at the same time. The reason we prefer Rog artifact for this type of remnant targeting is because Rog logbooks tend to be cheaper than the Danig and the Tujen ones, and they're close in price to the Gwenin ones. The problem with that is that you aren't going to get your money back on the Gwenin artifacts, whereas crafting Rog items can also still be very lucrative as well as the influenced jewelry items. It's not uncommon to Rog craft items that are worth multiple exalts in the first few days of the league, so this might end up being a non-insignificant portion of the profit you're making. Now, eventually you're going to move on to Tujen logbook farming, or maybe you skipped ahead. I'm not really going to tell you when to do this. And once you're there, you can then evaluate whether you're ready to move on to Danig logbooks if you're strong enough to kill Olroth. If you're not strong enough to kill Olroth, just don't do it, because Danig is going to yield lower profit per hour than Tujen, most likely. Now, when you're doing the Danig and the Tujen logbooks, you are always prioritizing artifacts. You're not really caring about the remnant stuff. If you get good remnants along the way, fine, but don't plan your routes. Don't start taking ages doing your logbooks. Just go for the artifact chests. Get as many of them as possible. If you come across remnants that buff the quantity of those artifacts, fine, go for it. Otherwise, just tunnel on those chests. A lot of the profit from this entire strategy just comes from cycling through the Danig and the Tujen windows. The only thing you need to know about the map choice here is you need to run open maps, and they need to be tier 14 plus so that you're not dropping low level logbooks. That's it. You can pause the video and read this entire page if you want, but the TLDR of it is that if you are running tight layouts, things such as the toxic sewers from my blight strat, you're going to end up in a situation where all of your remnants are way too spread out, all of your runic monsters are too spread out, and you won't be able to reach as many of them as if you just had an open map where you can make easier connections between everything. You're going to have walls and corridors between these runic monsters. It's not going to be a very efficient way to farm this strat, so just any open maps, chuck your expedition scarabs in, and avoid the tight maps and the maps that are indoors and have rooms. As mentioned in the pros and cons section, the requirements for this are pretty low. So all you need to be able to do is beat map expedition encounters that are just with remnant modifiers. All you need for that is a decent league starter. You need moderate investment. You don't need high investment. I highly recommend getting yourself a block reduction chance gem. You can get this by vendoring a puncture gem with something else. I can't remember off the top of my head, but you can just look it up. It's a vendor recipe, and this is going to be very helpful if you have to pick up the remnants that give the monsters block chance. Even if they're not capped on block, often switching to this gem is still a DPS increase. So just have one handy, and I would recommend going for skills that can have their damage types converted easily. So if you're playing lightning damage, having a Call of the Brotherhood on hand to convert that lightning damage to cold damage, for example, or being able to convert cold to fire or fizz to lightning, stuff like that via gems or items, gear swaps, that's going to be very helpful in case you pick up certain immunities. When you move on to Tujen and Danig farming, all you need to be able to do is kill a tier 14 plus Varana or Olroth, and as written on the slide, it just requires all the same stuff as above, but a little harder. That's it. The strategy you're going to be using when you encounter expedition via scarabs in maps is to simply target and prioritize all of the runic monsters available to you. Now, while you're clearing out the area before you can actually place explosives, it's a really good idea to pay attention to what remnants are nearby. This might give you an idea what kind of path you want to take. However, I don't recommend spending any additional time planning the path once you're able to put down the explosives. Once you have access to the explosives, simply plan out the fastest path possible, getting as many runic monsters along the way. It's totally okay if you see logbook quant at the end of that path. You may feel compelled to undo all of the explosives and redo a more efficient one. This is actually a mistake. This leads to lower profit per hour almost all of the time, and I know because I tested it. It turns out that just maximizing the amount of runic monsters you're excavating per hour is the best way to go. A lot of the reason why this happens is because all of the extra logbook and item quant that you're getting from the remnants is stacking additively with the quant inherent to the map, and all of that quantity is adding up together and then being diminished, because all of quantity in PoE suffers from diminishing returns, except for the one time that GGG made an exception with the Scourge League quantity. Where once we used to plan our logbooks out using MS Paint, nowadays you just tunnel the shit out of artifact chests. That's literally it. Don't even plan the path, just find all of where most of the artifact chests are on the map, and go for that. That's all you need to care about. Now, if currency, harbinger, and heist chests are along the way, you may as well pick some of those up. Underground areas, if they're kind of near your path, you may spend a few explosives to go get them, but prioritize the hell out of artifact chests. That's pretty much all you should be doing. Once upon a time, the expedition-based rewards were a lot stronger. You were able to go into certain logbooks and generate hundreds of splinters if you were lucky by stacking up all of the base reward multipliers. But these have been heavily nerfed, and they have been ever since Expedition League ended. So nowadays we just go for the artifacts. The artifacts are no longer tradable, and they've massively increased in value because of other things. A very big contributor to their current value is the fact that Nemesis farming no longer really exists. Nemesis farming greatly devalued raw currency, and raw currency is the primary reward of Tujin. So now Tujin is the new form of Nemesis 3. If you want to farm lots of raw currency, you're doing logbooks instead of Nemesis. Now, the only exception to all of this is when you're doing Rog logbooks, because we don't really value the artifacts just as much, and we maybe want to get some more loot, some of the base loot from the logbook, we can afford to go for the influence remnants. So now when you go for the influence remnants and you combine them with jewelry remnants, the result is that you're able to produce influence jewelry. These bases are very, very expensive at the start of the league. In fact, GGG managed to catch on to the few people doing this and nerfed it from 35% to 20%. But it's still going to be incredibly powerful, and it's still something you should go for if you see the opportunity. But Rog logbooks are the only place I would do this. Tujin and Danig are way too valuable to be giving up their artifacts. And as a general rule for logbooks, if you're thinking too hard, you lose. Doing 13 of these per hour should be a minimum. Now, obviously, on a league start, you're probably going to be looking at 10 if you're going really, really fast, but going any less than that means you're really not going to be earning your Mageblood by day 5. If you're going to be doing Rog logbooks, then you need to know how to Rog Craft, and the approach that I'm going to share today is the one used by one of the people that used Expedition in 3.17 to earn their Mageblood, and I've adjusted their strategy slightly to fit the metagame that I believe is going to be coming in 3.18. But otherwise, all credit goes to him. I didn't come up with this. So basically, you're going to focus on evasion and evasion armor hybrid items, and then also jewelry. The reason you're going to be doing this is because jewelry can roll with life and resist, and tends to just sell really well early in the league for some reason. And also, the evasion and evasion armor bases are going to be able to roll spell suppression, and getting life and spell suppression instantly makes the item much more valuable than if you were to get life and some res. Now, if scrap metal is too expensive, you can go for the evasion and energy shield hybrid bases or pure armor bases, but those aren't as good, so only go for the tier 1 and 2 versions of those bases if possible. Alright, you're only going to hit the skip button when the craft could make the item worse. A lot of people like the approach of skipping when the upgrade doesn't make the item that much better, but it is expensive, and the reason we're not going to use that approach is because if you skip too often, you might end up in a situation where the next proposed upgrade will definitely make your item bad. So, for example, you get offered the ability to upgrade the tier of a modifier that is already at tier 2, and it's not a very important mod. So you skip it because you don't want to spend the currency for it, but then you get proposed an upgrade where you have to reroll all of your prefixes, and your prefixes are really good. So at that point, your crafting is over, you have to take the item. You really want to avoid this. The only hard decision you're going to have to make when you're Rog crafting under these conditions is whether or not you want to go ahead with a reroll that is going to reroll good stats that are at a low tier. So for example, sometimes it will propose rerolling off low tier lightning res and low tier life. And you might be thinking, well, The life and the lightning res aren't at a good tier, but re-rolling them is probably going to get me something worse. The biggest question you have to ask here is the item sellable if you skip that point in the upgrade process? So even though you might be halfway through, and even though the outcome is likely going to end up making your item worse, if you have low tier lightning res, low tier life, and not many other good stats on the item, it's probably not sellable anyway. So you may as well take that risk. It's kind of like when you are playing a competitive game and you're in the losing position, and the only way you can win is by taking an absurd risk. Now, if you are winning, you wouldn't take that absurd risk because you risk throwing away a lead, but when you're losing, it's worth taking those absurd risks because the downside is simply losing like you are already going to lose. And in this case, if you already have an item that's unsellable, you may as well take one of those crazy risks on the off chance that the item does get vastly improved, as opposed to playing it safe and then ending up with a very mediocre item that's not going to sell for more than 2 to 3C and isn't worth the trading time. Our stat priority is very straightforward and makes a lot of sense when you consider that we are crafting for evasion builds. Evasion builds don't have many ways to mitigate against attack-based one-shots. All they have is max life. Now, max life doesn't have a cap, and you can earn it in every slot, which means most evasion builds are looking to get max life in every slot, and for that reason, we prioritize max life in every slot. So whenever max life is available, you're going to prioritize it, and if you have it on an item, you're going to want to keep it. Next up is movement speed on boots. Then is spell suppression. So a lot of people don't really think of this, but spell suppression can only come from a few slots, whereas resist comes from all slots. Even though both of these stats are capped, generally spell suppression is harder to get, and capping spell suppression purely from your gear lets you save a few points on the tree, versus resist where you can make up just about anywhere and through any means. So it's always max life, movement speed, spell suppression. You're going to also prioritize block and spell block above resistances. Now, these aren't super important on shields, and they're not going to make that big a deal, but if you have a shield that has spell suppression, block, and life on it, a lot of the other stats don't matter. At that point, you have a pretty good shield already, and that's going to sell for a decent amount of money in most cases, as long as the rolls are good. So 5th is resistances, and 6th is everything else. I'd like to make a longer list, but every slot has different stats that are specific to that slot, and a lot of it's situational based on weightings and stuff like that. So you're gonna have to figure it out yourself, but fortunately, you don't have a lot of customization anyway, so you have to take what you get. Just follow this list and you'll be fine. Now, the base priority may not make as much sense, but I'm going to explain why it exists like this. So our highest priority is shields, and the reason for this is that last league, 61% of all characters were using shields on day 1 of the league, at least according to PoE Ninja. Now, I know that's representative of the higher tier player base, but these are the people who are going to be buying your items in a lot of cases. And of all of those shields, the highest usage rate unique shield was only at 1%, which means all of these were rare shields for the most part. Next up is boots, and the reason we're going to prioritize boots is because you can also get them with movement speed. They are very high in demand. People will pay a premium to have 30% movement speed boots, even if the other stats on it aren't so great, because 30% movement speed means they're going to be able to progress through the content faster and start earning money quicker. So this is great. So next up is gloves, and the reason it's gloves is because the other two simply come at a lower priority. If you think about helmets, people are more interested in buying enchanted bases, which means Rog is sort of dead. And when it comes to body armors, a lot of people like to go from a tabular to a 6-linked unique body armor. So gloves, on the other hand, isn't very high a priority as a unique slot, and you can get a lot of good things, such as attack speed on gloves. It's got a lot of good Eldritch modifiers that you can get on gloves, so people like getting Rog Crafted gloves. If you get good life, good spell suppression, and resist rolls, you're good to go. Now, resistance-based rings come next, because again, helmet and body armor are a lower priority. Resistance-based rings, if you get life and some resistance on these, they'll easily sell for 10 to 20C, and they can even sell for as much as an exalt if you get a really good one and sell it to someone who is playing a build that doesn't need a unique ring. Finally, helmets and body armor. I would skip these most of the time, but if scrap metal is expensive in bulk, then you probably want to get more mileage out of each usage of your scrap metal and go for some extra helmets and body armors, but remember to only go for the tier 1 and 2 bases. Now, I've made a unlisted video where I just go through a few Rog gambles, so I only end up spending, I think, 1 or 2 scrap metals, and we pretty much just buy all of the evasion bases available to us, and I go through the process and kind of explain why we're making our choices. It's very easy to understand and follow along. It's only a few minutes, so if you're not very confident with Rog crafting and you want to see it in action, you can see how we can consistently make good sellable items using Rog by targeting the things that I've listed here. The preparation involved here is not that much different compared to the Blight strat that I put out, but we're going to go through it anyway because it does have some important differences. So to start off with, you want to take a geared character and you want to farm both logbooks and map expeditions using your logbooks and your scarabs. This is going to familiarize yourself with how these mechanics work, what sort of loot outcomes you should expect. You want to make sure that you can kill Olroth and Varana, so maybe buy a couple of the logbooks that have these bosses guaranteed and go do this fight a few times so that you can figure out how to do it. You want to also make sure that you are able to farm 10 to 13 Tujen or Danig logbooks per hour. If you're not farming this many per hour, you're not on pace. Most of the amount of currency I'm expecting you are able to make comes when you are running this content this fast. So if you're the kind of person that goes in and you spend a bunch of time looking at all the remnants and trying to figure out how to go, and you're clearing 3 logbooks per hour, which is a realistic amount for a lot of people from what I've heard, there's no way this strategy is going to work for you. You have to force yourself to ignore the remnants and to just go for the artifact chests. 13 per hour should really be a minimum, but I'm going to be a little lenient here and say 10 to 13. You want to practice haggling with Tujen, and then practice spending your Danig currencies on the exotic coins, the Astragalis, logbooks, and all of the discounted Tujen currency that pops up. You have to familiarize yourself with how this system works, because you need to do it fast when the league start comes. You want to be able to spend 6 reroll currencies per minute at a bare minimum. This means 10 seconds per window. This is probably a little more challenging to do for Tujen than it is for Danig, but for Danig it's easier to mess up and waste a bunch of currency, whereas with Tujen, messing up doesn't really have very large implications, because a lot of the money that comes from Tujen just comes from these like big items that you're getting, and making incorrect small purchases is not going to really affect you. So you want to then also go and test out your league starter in all this content. Make sure that if you're playing seismic traps, the amount of gear you intend to have on day 2 of the league can actually beat expeditions at tier 14. And finally, you want to just practice on improving your campaign times and your early Atlas progression. Unlike the Blight strat, we're not going to do infinite heisting and then skip ahead to red maps. You're going to have to actually progress your Atlas like a normal character, so this means you need to go get an SSF environment pretty much and start testing how fast you can reach red maps. This is really important. If you think about it, you should be able to get to tier 16 within one session of gameplay. If you can't, that's fine. Just do it on day 2, but definitely practice, because you can shave a few hours off this process, and a few extra hours shaved off means you're going to access the uninflated economy a little faster. You're going to be able to obtain some expensive upgrades cheaper than if you wait. You're going to be able to sell certain items for more than if you had waited. So there are a lot of uniques that will sell for 10C if you're able to sell them 1 hour, but the next hour they'll start diminishing down to like 2 or even 1C and eventually 1 ALC. So if you can get in early, you make a lot of money, you can really benefit from this. Like with the Blight strat, you would ideally be realigning your sleep schedule to wake up 2 hours before the league launch, but if you can't, you can't. That's fine. Okay, aim to finish the campaign within 4 to 6 hours of launch. You can optionally spend 4 to 8 hours infinite heisting to get the currency and then do the skip, like with the Blight strat, but this time it's only optional. You don't have to do it because you don't need to hit this insane amount of gear really early on. You can just have kind of mediocre gear and get away with it. So this is just optional. If you're someone who tolerates infinite heisting and you can appreciate the benefit of having access to this early currency and doing all this early chaos recipe kind of excites you, that's gameplay that you find fun, like me, then go ahead and do it. Otherwise, skip ahead because you definitely don't need to do it. Okay, so you're going to spend the remainder of day 1 just maximizing your Atlas progression. You're going to try and get as many level ups as possible, so don't take a lot of risks. You don't really need to go do all of the mechanics that show up except for map sustain, but don't go overdoing it when it comes to stuff like Legion. Don't go getting yourself killed. Once you start doing logbooks, your level is pretty much capped. You're not going to be able to level up anymore, and this is kind of a huge problem if you end up doing logbooks too early. So focus on leveling up while you progress the Atlas and don't take too many risks there. Once you hit tier 16 maps and your character's like good enough, then you can start buying up all of the rusted expedition scarabs that you can get, and you can just start this farm whenever you need to. Unlike the Blight strat, you don't need to wait until day 2 for things to come online. You can just get going right off the bat. If you have to live search singles to get going, fine, do it, but you can just get started whenever you want, and you're going to be making a lot of money straight off the rip, because all you need to do to start liquidating is basically just buy exotic coins after this and start trading in all the Tujen currencies that you've farmed up for actual raw currency, and then you're good to go. Logbooks will sell if you need to liquidate them early. They're not very hard. And before sleeping, of course, convert all of your chaos to exalted orbs. At the start of day 2, do a scan of the economy, figure out what the bulk prices are looking like. Maybe you want to start off with polished scarabs, maybe you want to start off with gilded. It really just depends on the pricing and the availability of these scarabs. Once you've figured this out and you have a decent amount of currency banked up, you can start live searching your item level 81 Rog logbooks. Your main goal for day 2 is getting into 2-gen content, so if you can skip the Rog logbook process, go ahead and do it. Otherwise, go do a Rog for a bit, farm up these influenced items and the Rog crafted items, and this should get you a few big ticket sales that are going to allow you to snowball your build a little further and then start doing 2-gen content. Now once you're in 2-gen content, you're just farming the artifacts, and you're going to end up in that 2-gen loop of farming the artifacts up to the cap, buying exotic coins, spending the exotic coins, and then going back into logbooks. You need to spend them regularly, and you really do need to buy coins. A lot of people get mad about the fact that you can't self-sustain the coins. This is just the reality of this situation. You have to buy them. Now, before you sleep, simply, again, convert your chaos to exalts. You have to do this every day for every strategy, because if you don't, the price of exalts are going to go up, and that means the relative value of your chaos orbs are going to go down. Your day 3, 4, and 5 schedule don't have to look too different to the way you ended day 2. You're pretty much just doing 2-gen logbooks and then evaluating whether the conditions are right to move on to Danig logbooks. I really have to stress, don't feel compelled from your ego or anything like that to do Danig logbooks, because I've said that that's the end point of the progression here. You may end up screwing yourself over. So a big part of the profitability of Danig logbooks are doing Olroth. So 1 in 5, 1 in 6 of these logbooks will spawn an Olroth, and this is a pretty hard boss fight. It's got its own little room, it's got its own mechanics that you have to know about, and on top of that, like with all of the expedition bosses, stacking up remnants gives you 5% more of the reroll currency per remnant. So when you have a fully juiced Olroth, you should be getting between 25 and 30 medallions. Obviously, it can actually go a lot higher, but I typically see between 25 and 30 medallions. Not most, but a very large portion of Danig's profitability is these large medallion drops. So if you can't kill Olroth, you're better off just sticking with 2-gen, because you'll be making more money with 2-gen. So just do that, figure that out for yourself, and just get stuck into farming. Unlike Blight, this isn't super complicated. You just have to keep doing this. It's very low maintenance. Just put the logbook in, run the logbook, farm the artifacts, turn the artifacts in at the vendor, and just continue that cycle until you end up with a Mageblood. I said this video series was going to be 3 videos long, and unfortunately, due to the new keystone that came out today that buffs the reward and the difficulty structure of invitations at no extra cost, I'm no longer going to be making the 3rd video. Now rest assured, invitations are still going to be a great way to earn a Mageblood if you already know what you're doing. The main reason why I'm not going to be releasing a video on this topic, however, is because I'm no longer confident in being able to provide you a clear roadmap that provides very explicit progression for how to get there. It's going to be good, but I'm not going to do a video that's basically just 20 minutes of guesswork and saying, hey, this is probably going to work, and this is probably going to be okay on this build. I'd rather just not release the video at all. Fortunately, I have another good idea for a video, so instead tomorrow we're going to be discussing the 7 or 8 builds that ended up on my radar that I tested or people that I trust tested, the builds that I think are the best for earning a Mageblood, not just with my strategies but with other people's strategies as well, and I'm going to provide some links to guides and some resources, some POBs for all of the builds that I think are the best going into 3.18. If you like this video, give me a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.